I want to thank Mike Green for coming all the way into my studio from his studio, which are not in the same place. But, anyway, Mike is here with his salt and pepper beard, making me feel kind of bad and a little old. But let's not go there. Today's topic is, I think, remarkably important, and I need to kind of do a little setup on it so you'll understand why I did this. It is, believe it or not, highly technical. And if you want to figure out which is better, this site or that site, this is what real grown-up demographers use in order to make this happen. Now, you have to understand, when you're doing demographic research, you are not simply saying there are so many people who live here, or there's so many people moving here, or the competition ratio is here, and therefore we're all good. That is not really going to tell you, doctors, what you need to know, because you're going to be investing your time and your money and your credit into a site. And in order to do that, you have to project into the future, what's this area really going to be like? Is it going to be worth doing? Am I going to get a return on my investment? And that's what demographers are supposed to be doing for you. So forget this idea that you already know what all the variables mean. Who does? What you really have to understand is, things like disinvestment effects or events. So let me explain what that means. A disinvestment event, as I'll explain as I go to my little copy here, are those events that are going to affect the value of a site and its potential to deliver money to the person who either owns or leases it. Now, this is usually made up of things that most people don't understand as being part of demographic site analysis. To give you an example, you may say competition ratio. That's really important. Yeah. But the growth rate, and more importantly, the amount of money people make in an area, how much violence there is in the area, or crime statistics. These are what they refer to as a soft number, because they by themselves, they don't have some great, terrible impact that people would understand, but it is still a great and terrible impact. The fact is, many of the stable truths that we used to rely upon to determine whether a location was good for a practice or bad have changed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. What's changed is that there are reliable truths we had about what areas were growing and how much they were growing, how much they should be gaining or losing in terms of income and population. So everything is in flux. We've had to go and reinvent some of the technologies that we're using in evaluating sites. And I want to talk to you today about some of those changes that are going on. The technology of demographics is always shifting because populations are shifting. But how we evaluate these numbers and what they're going to mean to you to determine whether a site is good in which to open a practice, or to close a practice, to sell, how much you should sell it for. Well, let's just say this: the data is in flux, and therefore I want to share with you some technologies that are going on to evaluate whether a place is good or bad. There are also local news events that have happened recently that are going to affect whether or not a site is good for you to practice in or not. So stick with me. This can be one of the more important episodes that we've had on where to put a practice. Now, we call the technology that we're using disinvestment events and professional practices. Now, a disinvestment effect or event is essentially what's happened in the news that may change how people think about a particular place in which to practice. We've had some civil unrest recently. We've had the pandemic, which has also really made some locations much better than others and much worse than others because of it. So I want to talk to you about how to measure these disinvestment events and how it's going to affect your choice on where to put a practice. Please, let's go to a fact. Professional practice sites and the practices in them are more vulnerable than other kinds of businesses. Now, I will admit that restaurants and bars have been heavily regulated, and because they're a place in which social interaction occurs, have been very heavily uh, well influenced by how government policies are. But it's also true with professional practices. So let's talk about how you are vulnerable in a professional practice. The small size of your office, the limited staff numbers, and the limited number of investors, or in other words, people are putting money into your office, it makes it so that you can be hurt by very small events. News trends are going to influence how much money you're going to make and whether or not you should open or how you should open. Your practice, in number two, is highly dependent on patient loyalty. If people don't like you, they fear you, they worry about the availability of your services or whether the services are going to be too expensive or painful, well, it makes you dependent upon the loyalty of a population out there. That is the nature of professional practice, particularly healthcare practices. Now, you take in a relatively small geographic area, and that is also kind of an issue. The average practice will get between 70 and 80% of its patient base from usually a 5-minute drive time. Now, it doesn't mean that people won't travel from further away. They certainly will. And in rural areas, they'll travel much further. But the fact remains that the geographic area that you're drawing from for the core of your practice is fairly small. That means that events that occur in this small area are going to matter a lot. There's also an impact, let's say, within this geographic area to other practices. So I know that a lot of doctors are worried about how many competitors are there in the area. I'm not quite as worried about it as perhaps you might be, because there's a perception that every competitor is going to hurt you. I don't necessarily believe that to be true. But there's something else. This fourth item about vulnerability of your practice is rather important. The doctor, the owner, the management, and other key responsible parties are concentrated in very few people. Even a large practice that may have 4 or 5 owners has almost all those owners in a very compact management structure. You may have a guy who's over HR, another guy over marketing, a woman who's in charge of human resources, whatever. The point is, you have very few people who are making the decisions. But number 5 is particularly important because the flexibility that having a small business, and particularly a professional practice of similarly trained and motivated people, is a big benefit. So in short, you can make decisions on how you want to change, where you want to go, extend hours, how your pricing structure goes, is extremely flexible. And that is a benefit to you because it doesn't take a long time to make changes that are going to be obvious. Now, the great predictor on whether or not the location in which you're considering practice is going to be good or bad is what they refer to as a disinvestment event. Now, disinvestment events are not necessarily tied to demographics. So, in other words, the competition ratio might not change, but the large employer who's been feeding people into your practice may. And that is a disinvestment event. The problem is a lot of our competitors say that they take into account demographics, but they don't take into account events. These disinvestment events that are going to affect how successful or unsuccessful the practice will be. So I'm trying to explain to you, we're adding a level of complexity to understanding the location in which you're practicing. I'll explain here in just a second. There are certain places in the United States that have had riots, and that everybody's worried, is that going to affect my practice? Even if I'm not in a riot area, what if people hear about the same time that I'm in? How about a crime spree? And meaning, in other words, are people doing something that is wrong or is bringing them a bad, uh, way of people looking at the site. Now, let me give you the example of Columbine, Colorado. Two young men killed all these people in a high school. Now, Columbine was a long enough time ago that many of my viewers here may not know about it, but it created an image for Columbine, the community, that lasted for a long period of time. And this is what people call a disinvestment event. So it carried over. The same thing happens in or unemployment. There are some large employers, particularly in the Rust Belt for a while in the 70s and 80s, who closed down and laid off a lot of people. That is not necessarily a demographic fact, but it was a disinvestment event that made people afraid to set up practice in those locations. Ironically, unemployment events often change very quickly. Crime sprees are not permanent. A riot is an event. It's a thing that may be over in a relatively short period of time, and therefore opportunities come. But the fear that people who are considering practicing in the area or people who are patients in the area are going to be affected by these events. Economic downturns are usually over a longer period of time, and they're also usually going to cover a larger geographic area. But there are plant closings or a large layoff that happens, and this is an economic downturn that is a disinvestment event that scares people off. Now, I'm bringing this up particularly for those of you who are thinking about selling a practice. You may assume that the negative news is going to hurt how much you can ask for in the practice. Part of what you need to do is to put in context those events that happen that may look like bad news. And actually, they are both a risk and an opportunity. Now, I say an opportunity because sometimes the places that have the worst news actually are not doing as badly as some people may assume they are. And therefore, there are both risks and there are opportunities that you have to take advantage of. Now, I'm going to bring up something that's a little bit of a touchy topic, and I hope that you will forgive me if I hurt someone's feelings. This map that I'm showing is of South Central Los Angeles. The Watts area is literally directly south of the downtown Los Angeles, and the area that is off to the left, or in other words, to the west side, is LA International Airport. Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of rioting, a lot of problems that occurred within this area. And people assumed that forever Watts would be devastated by the image of what it went through. It had disinvestment events that really hurt it. The big box stores that were in the area were looted and robbed. And this is maybe something that's affecting people who are in other states that have seen some sort of a violent social upheaval. I am not saying that the area recovered easily or quickly. It really did not. That's no fault of the people who were living and working in the area. However, remember that what happened in Watts is not a permanent change. It is something that developed over time. Yes, there were fires and destruction and all those kinds of things, but there was also an entirely new population that moved into the area. The population that had been there before actually moved, and they were displaced by another demographic population who set up their own lifestyles and their own economy, if you will. That happens, and demographers can tell you it's not so much that a bad thing is going to happen, but a bad thing happened that can be changed over time. Now, disinvestment events are going to affect certain things. They're going to affect demographics. For example, growth and income and housing. But the psychographics, in other words, the consumer patterns of the people in the area, that also is going to be affected by a disinvestment event. But think of it this way. It's not as though this is a permanent change. It's rather just an indication that changes are going to occur on what people do for a living, where they're willing to commute, what they're willing to pay for their housing. Let's just put it this way. competition changes as well as all these other factors change. Now, remember, technological innovations also are going to affect those areas that have gone through big stress, a disinvestment event. So with the pandemic, for example, a lot of people are now working out of their homes. Large employers are sending people home to work. This is a technological innovation which has strongly affected the economies in local areas. Now, why does that matter to you? It means that a place that you never had thought to put a practice may be spectacular because the property values, the places to refer and to get referrals are also going to change. There's also sociological changes, and these are not just demographic or psychographic. Sociological changes relate to how people relate to each other. Sometimes they can be very bonding and very, very beneficial. Sometimes they're going to be negative. But this is how disinvestment events, like we've just seen, are changing where to put a practice, often positively. Now, where are most disinvestment events happening? Well, California probably wins the prize for the largest area that has gone through disinvestment events. And many of these events are not due to major earthquakes or fires or wars or whatever. It's caused because of public policy. Now, in this case, we're expecting property taxes in California to go up dramatically. Part of this is because they need money, and property taxes are an easy way to tax people who are unlikely to move. Sales taxes in California are also likely to increase because the government finds it as an easy way to track revenue that's going to come into an area. Now, if you're figuring out where should I put a practice, you want to know what changes are occurring in property taxes and sales taxes. But another thing which is happening in California are the unfunded mandates. The government has not paid very much money into those coffers that are going to rebuild buildings or put people back to work. CalPERS is the state employment fund. It's kind of like what all the unions rely upon is CalPERS. It's the biggest fund of its type. And because CalPERS is now looking at shortfalls in revenues, they've got to figure out how else are we going to get it. And part of this is going to be through mandates that come through people at work. The state also has an unfortunate unbalanced budget. There was a time in which California had lots of excess money, but that has since turned around, largely because of policies the state has taken. Now, does this matter to you as a doctor trying to figure out what to put a practice? Well, the answer is yes, it does, because it's going to affect how many people are willing to move to the area to increase its growth and its income. California seems to be in a mode to try to do everything it can to get people to move out of the state. And there's also the issue of social unrest. Now, one thing that investors like is stability. California seems to be on the edge all the time of unstable social unrest. And because of that, a lot of people are saying, I'm going to pass on that place. And they'll choose other locations. But I'm going to talk to you in a second about where those places are. Now, I have a friend who lives in New York City in Manhattan. She's a gifted actress and has had a very, very rich career. But unfortunately, she said, New York died and nobody could go to the funeral because we're all locked down. Now, it's interesting to note that other places in New England are not locked down. They're doing reasonably well, and everybody was a little surprised by it. Even in Maine, a state which hasn't had a great deal of growth, looks better than it ever has. Connecticut, doing a little bit better. So what I'm really getting at is it's not a permanent thing. And very often the disinvestment events are caused by the government body that they're found in. So ultimately the question comes down to who decides when we're winning? Who decides when to open our doors? Who says that we should start doing what we can to help businesses to grow? Well, the point is there's no perfect authority that's going to help that to happen. Now, the states that right now seem to be having the greatest disinvestment events, in short, they're putting themselves at risk, are California, Michigan, New York City, which I know is not a state, but the area of New York State, New York City, the five boroughs, are having a problem, some more than others. Minnesota and Illinois, particularly in the greater Chicago area. They have a lot of things that are making it difficult for people to want to invest because the property values that they're investing in are not necessarily going up. They're not all going down, and certainly not at the same rate, but it's happening. Now, there are other places which have what we call investment events, meaning there are things that are getting better, and therefore these are the states that it's very hard not to recommend for a new practice to consider or to start up or to purchase. So if we look at Texas, there are lots of places in Texas that are doing well because they're adding to their employment. Cost of living is not increasing. The tax rate is pretty much in a restrained mode. Nevada, and this surprised me, is when we looked at Southern Nevada, particularly at Las Vegas, things are looking a lot better. It's as though people in Nevada said, we're just not going to participate in the bad news. So they've got an investment strategy going on, and Nevada, particularly Southern Nevada, seems to be doing much better than anybody predicted. Now, the same thing is true of Arizona. Maricopa County and Pima County are the two largest counties in Arizona. Maricopa County is where Phoenix is, and Pima County is where Tucson is. And surprisingly, they're doing much better than anybody thought either. Now, part of that is because they've kept their tax rates fairly low, but they've also had an influx of people from other states who are saying, I don't want to handle another winter. I want to go to a place where I can have a backyard and get a good return on my investment in a home. Arizona's done very well here. A lot of people don't recognize that Idaho last year was one of the fastest growing states in the United States. It isn't so much that Idaho had the best potato crop ever. It's that a lot of people came to Idaho from other states, including Washington State, because they could afford to get a nice house or a house that was reasonably priced at a reasonable size. And so Idaho did very well. I was surprised to find that Coeur d'Alene has done better than anybody was expecting, but of course, Greater Boise, Ada County, was doing well. And I was even a little surprised to find that Eastern Idaho, Idaho Falls, has done better. Now, part of this is because it's affordable to live there. Utah, as traditionally everybody knows, has been doing very well. High-tech firms have decided to move to Utah, and this in itself is a kind of investment event. But we notice that this change in Utah is not reserved for Salt Lake County and Utah counties, which are up north, but even go down to Santa Clara County, which is in the southern state. Investment events are happening throughout Utah, meaning it's a place that people can get a return that is reasonable on their investments. And large employers from outside of the state have figured that out. I was also pleasantly surprised to find out that almost all parts of Florida are doing better than they have done before with investment events. And it used to be this was primarily southeastern Florida, but the mid-state and the west, the greater Tampa area, surprisingly doing very well. Sarasota and Bradenton, again, surprisingly good. And I'm finding that there are events that are happening or characteristics of how these areas are developing that are looking good. Now, we call these investment events as opposed to disinvestment events. A disinvestment event, remember, is a reason not to go there. An investment event is a reason to go. Now, there has been increased statistics this week that I need to share with you. And one of those is, well, several cities are voting to defund the police. Now, I won't go into who and why. I'm just going to say, if that happens, that's a disinvestment event that is going to make a lot of employers, particularly small and mid-size employers, leave the area. Several cities are continuing in their lockdown. There's a kind of paranoia that they don't want to look at the COVID-19 pandemic as being over. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not going to go into it, except I'll simply say that there is a contrast between those places which are allowing aggressive reopening and those that are not. And the quality of life is increasing dramatically for those that have allowed opening. Whether it's wise or not, I don't know. I'm not that person to ask. Now, you also know that violent protests are likely to continue. Not all of them are going to continue in the same places, nor for the same reasons. But these are also disinvestment events, and they count against a location. Now, the other thing I thought I'd mention that is kind of interesting is we're having a military disagreement, let's say, with the political class, where bases should be put, where we should put soldiers overseas. And in fact, the story du jour is about Germany. Should we bring a large number of our troops and post them someplace outside of Europe, particularly outside of Germany? There are reasons why this is a good idea and reasons it's a bad idea. Again, that's not my thing. But I will say that this is having an effect on places within the United States that have a large military presence. And I think we're going to see the other shoe drop on that within the next few weeks. Now, also increased statistics this week are having an impact on where to put a practice. And I think it's going to be worth noting. Now, one of those things about the NASDAQ composite was it closed at a record high this week. The composite index. And it just means those places, and Seattle is going to be a good example, parts of New York State, some of the Atlantic coast, some within mid-America are looking at a reinvestment in the high-tech firms. And that could have a big effect on where you practice. The S&P 500 turned positive for the year this week. Now, everybody was predicting bad things for the S&P 500 or the S&P 5000, and it surprised everybody with the index looking better and better. Energy stocks also got a big boost from OPEC this year. Well, really this month, in which they decided to not close off production, but rather to make sure that the prices for oil and gas were better. Now, you may say, I happen to be an oncologist. What do I care? Or I'm a veterinarian. Does the energy stocks matter? Maybe not directly, but your practice, as I said at the beginning, is relatively small and vulnerable. And for that reason, when big events happen in the market in which you're practicing, your practice is going to do better. That's what we're in the business of doing at Dr. Demographics, to help explain what good things are happening and what bad things are happening, so you get a good return on your investment. Shares of airlines, retailers, cruise lines, and other companies are tied to the reopening of the economy, and this has led the market higher. This is one reason that I believe that the Deep South, in particular Florida and Georgia, are doing much better than anybody predicted. So does that mean you're going to pick up and buy a practice or start up someplace there? Maybe. Now, there's also increased employment, which surprised everybody. The jobs report that came in a little over a week ago, it has affected a lot of people, and they were surprised. You see, we're always looking for disinvestment, bad news, bad things. But if you are in the business of finding out where to practice and how to practice, these investment events are being very helpful. Now, one of the things I believe is parts of the United States are doing very well and some places are doing very badly. The contrast between good and bad sites matters a lot. Now, a couple of other things I want to just point out. Anecdotal news events are the ones you always hear about on the news, but they're anecdotal. They don't really show a major trend. If somebody burned down a large business or a hotel caught fire and lots of people died, that's anecdotal. I'm not saying it's not important, but its impact on a large segment of the American population is not as big. There are trends for the broader marketplace, however, where everything is happening that are going to be important. Now, we track these things at Dr. Demographics for your information. we're also having, we will refer to as a bifurcated impact. And that kind of goes along with this idea that some places are doing great, some places are doing badly, but the differences between them two make this even more profound. There are lots of places you're never going to hear about. Places that are not having violence or that are not going through a major upswing or down swoop in their economies. But you need to understand that sometimes a place will have both very good and very bad news, and in that way it's bifurcated impacts from the same events. Now, I have a question for you, and I want you to really seriously think about it. What side will America voters choose? Are they going to be optimistic or pessimistic? Now, that is really the message between the Republicans and Democrats right now. People are making up their minds to say, are we going to hell in a handbasket, or are we on the upswing? You may have to make the decision to say, this is going to matter where I live and work and not on the nation as a whole. So the truth is, nobody really knows exactly what's happening, but it's a big deal. What's happening and what's likely to happen. I believe that people are going to tend to vote on the idea of an upswing. They don't want to buy into the idea that we're doomed. There are some people who love the idea that we're doomed. I'm just not one of them. Now, I'm still offering the flash report for the demographics. We're probably going to wrap it up in just a couple of days. And we've gotten a lot of people who've ordered these reports. It's basically a demographic report that runs for about half price. We've done it because there are a lot of people who've been whining and having a real problem. We're still discounting the marketing report, which is kind of Mike's baby. And I just want to make sure you understand, Mike has got a podcast he does. And maybe some of you have seen it. I'm going to tell you something. I'm thoroughly impressed. Not just because I taught Mike everything he knows. No, there are other reasons for that, but I'm impressed. His whole idea of handling what the major trends are in marketing and how to use them for a professional practice, I think is nothing short of brilliant. Now, look, you guys, we offer a marketing report. This is the best, most cost-effective way to figure out how to promote your practice. Mike comes out and visits people throughout the United States. He can work with your office. He can work with your team to make sure your staff and the doctors are using what they've got during this time of transition. Not everybody's taking advantage of it. I know that. And I know Mike doesn't just love traveling all the time. But what he's doing is brilliant. And Mike, is there anything you want to add to this?
We're at time, but the thing that I was thinking about as you're talking through this is that, especially when we're talking about marketing, but actually practice placement as well, we're playing the long game in most cases, not in every case, but in most cases, we're playing the long game. And so it's really important to understand historically what's happened in the area that you're considering and be prepared for whatever may happen in the future. And the doctors that have their minds wrapped around those two things are much better suited to deal with a disinvestment event that may happen that was unexpected. And if they're playing the long game and have that perspective in the strategy that they're deploying, they insulate themselves much better than doctors that are not thinking in those terms. And for those of you that are not looking at the historical numbers, which we provide in great detail in the reports that we do, you're really you're cheating yourself of some important numbers of showing when the growth happened, if it's happening, and how it's predicted for the future. And you can develop a much stronger strategy by understanding the historical numbers, growth patterns, disinvestment events, and investment events that happened over that period of time, so that you can make the best decision, not only in marketing, but also in practice placement.
Now, Mike, real quick, how do they get onto your marketing thing?
So
and you have a series you're starting, right?
Yeah, the best thing to do is to go to the website, and under the training tab, there is whiteboard training, and that's what I've titled it. So that just click on that, and you'll be able to find all of those episodes.
Uh, I'm finding it a remarkable resource, and guys, if you're not using it, it's kind of on you. Uh, Mike is starting a series where you can go into several classes in which you will learn the fundamentals of practice promotion. And I'm telling you, it's very good, very well researched. And like I said, Mike has gotten a lot better. I mean, you should have seen him at the beginning. My God.
Oh my gosh.
Kind of pathetic. He didn't have a beard, back then. So anyway, you guys, thank you so much for listening. Sorry to go over, but I hope you find this useful. Take care.